Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps.
All right, so think about it. Those moments in history where the world feels like it's like teetering on the edge,
Yeah.
like right on the brink of
Uh,
disaster.
yeah.
And then the immediate crisis passes. Everyone kind of breathes a sigh of relief.
Yeah.
But what happens under the surface?
Yeah. Right.
That's what's so fascinating, right? It's like all the shifting and the changing and
Or maneuvering.
the maneuvering.
Yeah. The strategy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so today we're gonna dive deep into that world.
Okay.
Specifically, we're looking at the CIA's activities against Cuba
Okay.
immediately following the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So we're talking just weeks after the world thinks that, nuclear war has been averted.
Right.
And these guys are already figuring out their next steps.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the Cuban Missile Crisis, those 13 days in October of '62 when nuclear war really did seem possible.
It wasn't just about the immediate threat.
Right.
I mean, it reshaped how the U.S. approached the entire Cold War.
Yes.
The rivalry with Cuba, the rivalry with the Soviets. I mean, it's a fascinating turning point.
It is, and we've got these declassified CIA documents, internal memos
Oh, wow.
from November 1962.
Okay.
And that's what we're diving into today,
Right.
to figure out what their game plan was.
Okay, great.
So what's really fascinating about this is that the U.S. government, to resolve the missile crisis, to get the missiles out of Cuba,
Right.
had to make some pretty significant public assurances to the Soviets.
Right.
And so what we're going to see here is how those assurances actually constrained, how they shaped the CIA's subsequent operations against Cuba and Castro.
Yeah, and I think that's something that people maybe don't always think about, right?
Right.
You have these big public pronouncements.
Right.
But how do those then filter down into, the nuts and bolts of intelligence operations?
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's a really critical question.
So let's unpack the first big kind of shift here. So what is the core thinking driving this new approach, considering those public promises?
Well, I think the central point, and you see this laid out pretty clearly in these memos, it really boils down to those assurances.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the U.S. essentially said, okay, we won't invade Cuba, we won't support anyone else doing it, but, and this is a crucial but, as long as the Soviets didn't bring back any offensive weapons,
Right.
and as long as Cuba didn't start posing, some kind of offensive military threat in the hemisphere.
So essentially, what's the immediate impact of that commitment?
So because of that commitment, this assumption that large-scale U.S. military intervention was probably off the table,
Yeah.
at least for the foreseeable future, it meant that some of those big, overt operations, the kind that could easily be seen as the first step toward invasion,
Right.
things like using large paramilitary forces to try and, kick off a quick uprising.
That was no longer really a viable primary strategy. I mean, at least not without a major change in U.S. policy.
Right. So you can't have these big public pronouncements
Right.
and then, a week later
Right. Exactly.
land 10,000 troops.
Right. Exactly. It's all about, plausible deniability and,
Right.
maintaining a certain level of, not rocking the boat too much.
Right.
So it really boxed in the CIA in a way. It forced them to move away from those more dramatic, very public operations.
So if those are less likely, what kind of approach did they pivot to?
Well, the documents use this interesting phrase. They talk about a long-term denied area type of operation of the highest priority.
What does that mean?
Well, what it means is they're thinking about a sustained clandestine effort
Okay.
inside Cuba
Right.
in a place where the U.S. couldn't operate openly militarily.
Okay.
So this really signals, kind of a shift to a longer-term,
Right.
more subtle game.
So the era of trying to get like a quick win,
Yeah.
a quick knockout blow,
Yeah, that's
kind of off the table now.
off the table.
Yeah.
Okay, so what then become the main goals of this new kind of patient approach?
So they really zero in on three key objectives.
Okay.
And the first, and by far the most important one, is this idea of intensifying intelligence and counterintelligence.
Okay.
This becomes like the top priority. Knowing what was happening inside Cuba,
Right.
that was absolutely paramount.
So specifically, like what kinds of information were they desperate to get their hands on?
Well, they're pretty specific about this in these memos. They wanted detailed intelligence on the capabilities and intentions of the Cuban government itself. They were also very focused on the activities of the Cuban G2.
And for those who aren't familiar, the G2 is essentially...
That's their main intelligence directorate.
Right, their CIA.
Exactly, their version of the CIA.
Okay.
And they also wanted to keep a close eye on their security apparatus.
Understanding the extent of Soviet and Eastern Bloc influence and activities in Cuba was also crucial.
Okay.
But it went beyond just the government and the military. They wanted to gauge the potential for internal resistance. So what was the morale of the Cuban people like? What was the state of their military? How strong were their militia forces?
Okay.
Who really held the power within the Cuban leadership? You know, where were the factions? Where were the potential fault lines?
Right.
And then, of course, they needed to understand Cuba's relationships with other countries around the world.
So it sounds like it's really a deep dive, like understanding
Agree, absolutely.
every facet of Cuba.
Every facet of Cuba under Castro. I mean, you can't really formulate a long-term strategy if you're flying blind, right? So intelligence was the absolute foundation.
Okay, so that's objective number 1. What's number 2?
Objective number 2 was to maintain maximum economic and political pressure on the regime. But, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, this pressure had to be applied through clandestine means.
Right.
Specifically, you know, avoiding those large-scale commando and guerrilla operations.
So no more Bay of Pigs.
No more Bay of Pigs, exactly. It had to be more subtle, more deniable.
Okay, so what's the rationale behind this continuing to squeeze Cuba economically and politically?
I think it served a dual purpose for the U.S. First, it was about directly weakening the regime's ability to govern, disrupt the economy, create internal challenges, hope that it leads to some kind of instability or even collapse.
Okay.
The second purpose was more about the Soviets.
Yeah.
It was designed to be a drain on their resources.
Okay.
So if the Soviets are having to constantly prop up the Cuban economy,
Right.
that's going to strain their resources. It might even create tensions within the communist world itself.
So a long-term strategic squeeze.
Exactly. A war of attrition playing out in the shadows.
Okay, and what's the third big objective?
The third objective focuses on exploiting vulnerabilities. They wanted to actively work to create divisions within the Cuban leadership, so discord within the regime itself, and then be ready to immediately capitalize on any significant uprising, any revolt, any kind of internal resistance that might emerge.
So they're constantly looking for a crack in the facade.
Exactly. Looking for any crack that they can potentially widen. Leadership struggles, friction between Cuba and the Soviets, anything they could exploit.
So we understand the shift in the strategy, the goals. Let's get down to like the specifics. What kind of operational actions did this new plan actually involve?
This is where it gets really interesting, you know, seeing how the intelligence sausage gets made. One key element was the exploitation of Cuban refugees.
Okay.
Now remember, the flow of refugees had been disrupted during the missile crisis.
Right.
So the plan was to reestablish regular air travel from Havana to Miami as quickly as possible. They were going to use Pan Am and KLM for this. And simultaneously, they were going to reactivate the Opelika interrogation center.
Okay, yeah.
Bring back the same personnel they had used before.
And so Opelika was, just again for listeners, that
this was a dedicated facility.
in Florida.
Yeah, in Florida. Specifically for debriefing Cuban refugees.
Okay.
So they saw these new arrivals as a really crucial source of fresh intelligence.
What other methods were they relying on?
Well, they also put a huge emphasis on maintaining and even expanding their existing network of agents inside Cuba.
Okay.
This was seen as essential for long-term intelligence gathering.
Right.
But of course, they recognized the inherent dangers of working undercover in a tightly controlled state like Cuba.
Sure.
So they also prioritized recruiting agents in third countries
Okay.
who could then be sent into Cuba.
So potentially attracting less suspicion?
Exactly. It was all about minimizing risk and maximizing the chances of success.
Yeah.
And they weren't overlooking legal travelers either.
Right.
Anyone who might have access to valuable information was seen as a potential recruitment target.
Okay.
Business people, academics, journalists, even tourists.
So they're casting a wide net.
They were leaving no stone unturned. They needed every scrap of intelligence they could get.
What about the more technical side of things? You know, like communications intelligence, that sort of thing.
That was a big one.
Yeah.
Communications intelligence, or ComInt, as it's often called.
Right. ComInt.
And their primary focus there was trying to penetrate the communication networks of the Cuban G2, remember their intelligence directorate,
Right.
but also the police and militia networks.
Okay.
The documents actually explicitly state that this, getting access to these communications, this was a primary problem they needed to solve.
Okay.
And then they were also going to continue and really ramp up their liaison operations,
Okay.
actively seeking more cooperation from allied intelligence services around the world.
And specifically, who were they looking to partner with?
Well, the list is pretty expensive. It includes the UK, the Netherlands, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, Norway, Denmark, West Germany, Mexico, Argentina, Uruguay, Canada, Chile, and even Israel.
Wow, so it's a real global effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's even a suggestion that the DCI himself, the Director of Central Intelligence,
Right.
should get personally involved in fostering these relationships,
Okay.
which really underscores how important this international cooperation was for gathering intelligence on Cuba.
So what other operational areas were they looking at?
Well, maritime operations were another key area of focus.
Okay.
Specifically, they were looking at trying to recruit Cuban seamen,
Okay.
including those working on Cuban-controlled vessels.
So anyone who's out there on the seas.
Exactly. Anyone who might have insights into Cuban activities or could potentially provide logistical support.
Okay.
They were also exploring ways to penetrate Cuban installations abroad,
Okay.
primarily by trying to recruit or induce the defection of Cuban diplomats stationed in other countries.
Oh.
The documents actually mention that they already had 12 such agents working for them and were actively targeting another 20.
Wow.
So they were really trying to exploit these overseas postings.
So in addition to human intelligence, were they also looking at more technical means like, electronic surveillance, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. They refer to this as audio penetrations,
Okay.
which is essentially a euphemism for electronic surveillance, bugging rooms, tapping phones, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And the plan was to maintain and selectively expand these operations where it was deemed most valuable.
Okay.
But they were also getting creative. They were looking at ways to leverage their existing penetrations of communist parties around the world,
Okay.
particularly in Latin America.
Okay.
And the idea was, if they had assets already inside these parties, could they redirect those assets against Cuban targets?
So if you've already got someone in.
Exactly. If you've already got someone in, why not see if they can also provide intel on Cuba? It's all about maximizing the use of your existing resources. And they were particularly interested in those with access to Cuban diplomatic circles, or who might have insights into Cuban activities in the region.
So lots of different threads they're pulling on here. What about more overt but deniable forms of influence, like propaganda, that sort of thing?
Yes, psychological warfare remained a significant tool in their arsenal.
Okay.
There were ongoing programs aimed at influencing the attitudes and opinions of the Cuban population.
Right, trying to undermine Castro's support.
Exactly. And they were also keeping the option of providing limited covert support to any genuine internal resistance movements on standby.
So if a real credible opposition group emerged.
Right, they wanted to be ready to help them out.
Mm-hmm.
But it had to be a genuine group, not something they were creating from scratch.
Okay.
And then on the economic front, they were planning to intensify their clandestine economic warfare efforts,
Okay.
focusing on denying Cuba access to critical materials. This could involve things like denial operations, preclusive buying, encouraging friendly nations and businesses to halt strategic shipments.
So it's really a multi-pronged effort to put pressure on the regime.
Absolutely. They were trying to squeeze them from every angle.
So we talked about these more overt but still deniable methods. What about some of the more aggressive tactics? Things like sabotage or even paramilitary operations. Were those completely ruled out after the missile crisis?
Well, the documents do indicate a pretty significant shift away from widespread, high-risk, aggressive tactics.
Mm-hmm.
Sabotage, for example, was only to be considered in very specific, rare instances,
Okay.
where they saw a really high-impact opportunity to significantly damage the Cuban economy.
Okay.
But even then, they were very clear that it had to be something with what they considered an acceptable level of risk.
Okay, so no more like widespread sabotage program.
No, more of those kind of broad brush efforts.
Okay.
And similarly, while they weren't envisioning any large-scale paramilitary invasions, like another Bay of Pigs, they did propose maintaining their existing facilities and the capability for such operations,
Okay.
just in case.
So they're keeping their options open.
They're keeping their options open, but with a much more cautious approach.
Right, so it's a much more measured and intelligence-driven strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Did this require any internal adjustments within the CIA itself? Were there any organizational or procedural changes proposed?
Yeah, actually, there were a couple of pretty key ones. The plan suggested a gradual but substantial reduction in both the budget and the personnel of Task Force W.
Okay. And just so everyone's on the same page, what was Task Force W?
So Task Force W had been a central unit within the CIA, specifically responsible for those more aggressive covert operations against Cuba
Okay.
before and during the missile crisis.
Okay.
So scaling that back kind of reflects that broader shift in strategy.
Right.
There was also a proposal to potentially reposition Task Force W within the Deputy Directorate for Plans, or DDP,
Okay.
which is essentially the CIA's clandestine operations arm.
Right.
So this suggests maybe a desire to integrate Cuban operations into more standard covert procedures, rather than it being this distinct standalone effort.
Okay. Interesting.
And then, perhaps most notably, there was a recommendation to abolish the Mongoose operational mechanism.
Operation Mongoose, we've heard that before. Can you just remind us what that was?
So Operation Mongoose was the code name for a really extensive and aggressive program of covert operations against Cuba that predated the missile crisis.
Okay.
And this involved everything from intelligence gathering and propaganda to sabotage and even, as we'll talk about a bit later, assassination plots.
Okay.
Now, this operational mechanism, what they're referring to is the specific interagency review and approval process
Okay.
that had been established to oversee all these activities.
Right.
So you can imagine it was probably quite a bureaucratic hurdle.
Okay, so they had to go through a lot of hoops.
Exactly. They needed detailed authorization for even relatively minor covert actions.
Okay.
So the recommendation to abolish it suggests a desire for a more streamlined and agile approach to their post-crisis operations,
Okay.
maybe with a little less oversight for every little thing.
Okay, so it sounds like the missile crisis triggered a real fundamental reevaluation of their whole approach, not just the tactics, but the internal structures. You mentioned that Mongoose was actually halted during the crisis itself. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so we have this really interesting memo from October 30th, 1962, which is right at the peak of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
And it details President Kennedy's direct orders to immediately stop all activities related to Operation Mongoose for several days. This included a temporary suspension of sabotage, infiltrations, guerrilla activities, even the stockpiling of weapons caches.
So even in the height of the Cold War, the immediate threat of nuclear war forces them to put a pause on.
Yeah, it really shows you how serious the situation was.
Right.
And the directive also explicitly instructed the CIA to do everything they could to prevent any refugee or emigre groups from undertaking any provocative actions against Cuba,
Okay.
regardless of whether the U.S. was aware of those actions or not.
Right. So anything that could, potentially escalate the situation.
Exactly. They didn't want any rogue actors messing things up at such a sensitive time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even a specific order to try and stop the activities of Alpha 66,
Right.
which was a fiercely anti-Castro Cuban exile group.
Right.
Although the DCI, he points out to the president that, the CIA didn't have any direct contact with or control over them.
Right. They were kind of a wild card.
Exactly. But even so, they were trying to rein them in. And the memo very clearly states that the direction of Operation Mongoose will be reconsidered after current negotiations are completed.
Right. So they knew things were going to have to change.
Exactly. The priority at that moment was de-escalation.
Yeah.
Everything else was secondary.
Okay. So once the immediate crisis is resolved, what happens to Mongoose? I mean, does it just pick up where it left off?
Not exactly. While that underlying goal of undermining the Castro regime that certainly persisted, the way they went about it, the operational framework, even the intensity of the efforts, all of that shifted.
Okay.
So we have a record of DCI John McConney discussing Mongoose with the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, or PFIAB, in December 1962.
Okay.
And McConney, he argues that even though Mongoose's primary aim was covert action,
Right.
it did contribute to the overall intelligence gathering on Cuba.
Okay.
He saw it as having some intelligence value, even if that wasn't its main purpose.
Okay, so it wasn't a complete loss in terms of intelligence. What else did he talk about in this discussion?
He also talks about what he called the intelligence letdown that followed the Bay of Pigs,
Right.
and the subsequent push to increase the interrogation of Cuban refugees as a source of information. And interestingly, McConney advocated for a more aggressive program of infiltrating agents into Cuba, specifically to gather straight intelligence about Soviet plans on the island.
Okay.
He felt that this should be the top priority for the next 3 to 4 months.
Okay, interesting.
He also voiced his strong opposition to using Guantanamo Bay as a base for launching these intelligence operations,
Okay.
fearing that if the U.S. were caught doing that, it would have very negative repercussions.
Right, it would be a major diplomatic incident.
Exactly.
So it sounds like he was pushing for a much more focused, intelligence-centric approach after that near-nuclear war.
Yeah, definitely a move away from some of the more overtly aggressive aspects of Mongoose.
So what about those more violent elements of the operation?
Well, McConey specifically mentions Mongoose B+, which he describes as involving plans for a relatively high level of violent actions.
Okay.
And he actually expresses some reluctance to endorse these plans,
Okay.
unless there was a clear guarantee of military backing, especially given that he still harbored some suspicion that the Soviets might have medium-range nuclear missiles, or MRBMs, secretly still on the island.
Wow.
He also notes that the focus of the Mongoose effort had, to some extent, been diverted by these ongoing concerns about continued Soviet activities in Cuba.
Right.
So the more extreme and overtly violent aspects of Mongoose were definitely being viewed with more caution in the immediate aftermath of the missile crisis.
So this near-death experience with nuclear war really instilled a sense of caution, leading to a more intelligence-focused strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis served as this stark and terrifying reminder
Right.
of the potential consequences of their actions.
Right.
And these documents, they offer this really valuable insight into the very real efforts to adjust that U.S. approach to Cuba in the wake of the crisis.
So it seems like the big takeaway here is that the Cuban Missile Crisis really was a major turning point.
It really is.
It forced a reassessment of U.S. strategy towards Cuba, leading to a more clandestine, long-term, intelligence-focused approach.
Absolutely.
And while those earlier, more aggressive initiatives under Operation Mongoose, with all its complexities and controversial elements, they existed, the aftermath of the crisis sees a clear move towards a more cautious and information-driven strategy.
Right. And I think what these post-crisis plans really highlight is that intricate balancing act of these covert operations.
Right.
The constant need for reliable intelligence, the ongoing desire to exert pressure on the Cuban regime,
Right.
and the ever-present consideration of how to exploit any internal weaknesses that might emerge,
Right.
all within the constraints of this new geopolitical landscape after the missile crisis.
It's really complex. So given these extensive and evolving clandestine efforts in the years following the Cuban Missile Crisis,
Right.
what was the real long-term impact of this shift in strategy on the Cuban regime?
Yeah, that's a huge question.
It is. What unintended consequences, might have arisen from this move towards a more subtle, intelligence-driven approach?
Right. And I think that's something that goes beyond the scope of these particular documents, but it's a really critical part of understanding the history, the long history of U.S.-Cuban relations.
So thinking about the effectiveness, the unforeseen outcomes
Okay.
of this strategic shift.
It's something really worth reflecting on as you continue to learn about this complex period.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into this truly pivotal moment in Cold War history. We'll see you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.